Greetings and salutations, gentle people. Today, let's talk about the PlayStation Classic. In September of 1995, the PlayStation launched in North America. Its launch lineup would include such games as Rayman, Ridge Racer, and Battle Arena Toshinden, but it wouldn't be long before they were joined by Twisted Metal and Suikoden later that same year, and the likes of Resident Evil, Crash Bandicoot, Persona, Twisted Metal 2, and the original Tomb Raider the next. Over 23 years have passed since, and now Sony is releasing the PlayStation Classic, a quote, miniature recreation of the original PlayStation, preloaded with 20 of the best titles from a game-changing era, unquote. Minus the AC adapter. That one gamers will just have to figure out on their own. One issue with that statement is that there is the assumption that the 20 games Sony has selected are the best, or at the very least some of the best titles from their launch platform. But what metric are these titles chosen? Is this determined by the sales of the titles themselves? The ratings offered? How high would a game have to be rated to be considered among the best? How many copies would have to be shipped for a game to be considered among the best? Looking at the list of games that are making the final cut, I'd say it's not bad. I wouldn't call all of them the best, let alone the average. There are a few standouts, such as Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, and Resident Evil, though I question their choice of using the director's cut versus the original. Other games don't deserve to stand alongside them, such as Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, which was given 1 of 5 stars by the official PlayStation magazine. Does Sony realize their own official magazine gave the game a terrible review? That said, there are a few games that I never got around to playing when they were new that are interesting. The one that's likely to get my attention is the original Persona. I had never heard of the franchise until the time when Persona 4 Golden was coming out, so it would be interesting to go back to its roots. I've also never played a Wild Arms game, and the farthest I've ever gotten into Siphon Filter was a short time with a demo. Like I said, the list isn't terrible, it's just not what I would consider the best, or in subjective terms, the games that people are the most nostalgic for. I browsed around looking at comments people had made on different websites, on what sort of games they expected to be on the PlayStation Classic. And while some people mentioned the big titles the system is missing out on, others narrowed things down to the hyper-specific games they remembered from their childhood. One person even requested the game Apocalypse, featuring Bruce Willis. It's hard to tell if they were joking about the suggestion or actually liked the game. I didn't actually own a PlayStation at launch. When it came out, I tried it at a friend's place. I remember playing an assortment of games he owned, including Twisted Metal, Kalik the DNA Imperative, and Lemmings 3D. It seemed cool because it was new, but at the time I wasn't particularly impressed with its lineup. I was satisfied with my Super Nintendo library. It was a couple years later when a different friend of mine was telling me about a game called Final Fantasy VII. He had a PS1 and a copy of the game, but no memory card. At the time, I had a Nintendo 64, but no PlayStation. Another couple years passed, and another friend of mine was telling me about a game called Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. I was wondering what was up with the game. Why were you playing as this guy with a sword? My friend actually hadn't played any previous Castlevania games and was surprised to discover that the main character of every other game used a whip. Since then, I've played quite a few PS1 games, but I admit there were some that I had missed. I got around to playing Final Fantasy VII, gave up on 8, missed 9 and Tactics. I played through Metal Gear Solid, both Medal of Honor games, but missed Xenogears, the Wild Arms series, and Suikoden. I played Spyro, but I didn't own a single Crash Bandicoot game until the trilogy was remastered for current generation consoles. I think my point in regards to this is that everyone is going to have their own subjective experience with the first PlayStation console, For me, games like Medal of Honor, Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, they represent the best of the PS1 library. It's here that I want to ask, is there a way to objectively choose 20 games to represent the entire game library of a system? Would it be determined by critic review scores? In theory, the best games are going to receive the highest ratings. Would it be determined by user review scores? It's audience appreciation that really determines what games remain the most iconic. Or would it be determined by games shipped? In theory, the best games are the ones that sell the most. First, let's look at what the list of games would be if they were judged by their critical rating. If we were judging the games based on their critical rating from the collection of scores posted on Metacritic as an example, then the PlayStation Classic would include Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, Chrono Cross, Colony Wars, Final Fantasy VII and IX, Gran Turismo 1 and 2, ISS Pro Evolution, Medal of Honor, Metal Gear Solid, Parappa the Rapper, Resident Evil, Spyro, Year of the Dragon, Street Fighter Alpha 3, Tomb Raider, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, Tekken 3, Vagrant Story, and Wipeout XL. Judging based on critical score brings a big change to the list, improving on it tenfold. I don't know if the PlayStation Classic needs multiple Tony Hawk games, but I admit I never got into the franchise. I've also never heard of Colony Wars or ISS Pro Evolution, but even knocking out these four leaves for an excellent list that's much more representative of the system than what's coming out with the PlayStation Classic. If you look at the user score, nearly half of the games on the list sampled from Metacritic are the same as the previous one, rounded up from critic reviews. The user list includes such games as Castlevania Symphony of the Night again, Crash Bandicoot 3, Dino Crisis 2, Final Fantasy VII and IX, but also Final Fantasy Chronicles and Tactics, Gran Turismo 2 again, except now we've got Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, and The Legend of Dragoon, Metal Gear Solid again, except now we've got Parasite Eve and Parasite Eve 2, Resident Evil, the original version, Resident Evil 2, Silent Hill, Suikoden 2, Tekken 3 again, except now we've got Vagrant Story and Xenogears. Basing the PlayStation Classic library on the user score is itself, though, a bit odd, especially when you consider that one of these games, Final Fantasy Chronicles, is just a port of NES titles. It would also mean that just short of half of the PlayStation Classic would consist of Square Enix titles, though for them the PlayStation 1 was their glorious hour. There's no denying that one, though that means that the PlayStation Classic's library wouldn't really have much going on in regards to variety. If you create a list based on shipped numbers, based on the Wikipedia entry, that creates a much odder collection of titles with somehow less variety. It has the first 4 Tomb Raider titles, both Gran Turismos, Final Fantasy VII through IX, Tekken 2 and 3, all 3 Crash Bandicoot games, along with Dragon Quest VII, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Metal Gear Solid, Rayman, Resident Evil 2, Spyro the Dragon, and Tekken 2 and 3. And yet, regardless of which list we're looking at, there's always going to be something missing for more particular fans. Looking at different comment sections shows a very wide selection of games that people are nostalgic about that are missing from the PlayStation Classic, or any of the lists I had just presented. Among their requests include Ark the Lad, of which is actually going to be released on the Japanese version of the PlayStation Classic. There are other requests that I wouldn't expect to make the cut, such as the Die Hard trilogy. I'm not surprised that Crash Team Racing isn't on the list, but it does seem to have its share of fans out there. I haven't heard of Jade Cocoon, Klonoa, or Toomba, but apparently there are people that want it. It's a bit of a surprise now that I think of it, though, that Crash Bandicoot wasn't considered as part of the PlayStation Classic's library, especially since Crash was the main mascot character for the PlayStation 1. That said, all this discussing what should make up the PlayStation Classic, consider this. With the exception of Battle Arena Toshinden, Cool Borders 2, Grand Theft Auto, Intelligent Cube, Persona, and Tekken 3, the remaining games can be purchased from the PlayStation Store right now for use on the PlayStation 3. A lot of the greatest games of the PlayStation 1 era have been ported regularly onto newer and newer systems. Crash Bandicoot recently had his trilogy remastered, and Spyro's trilogy is getting a remastered version quite soon. Castlevania Symphony of the Night just came out on the PS4. It's not the original version, but the only difference is they replaced terrible voice acting everyone's nostalgic about with terrible voice acting no one is nostalgic about. Still the same game, though it's hardly the first port of the title. If you don't want to play Konami's recent remastered, you can always hop onto an Xbox One, download the Xbox 360 version of the game for $10, and enjoy the original dialogue. Which leads me to a question that I've been asking since the Nintendo Classic, since the Super Nintendo Classic, and now the PlayStation Classic. What can these systems offer gamers besides a truncated selection of their libraries? Looking at previous collections of games, such as Capcom's recent beat-em-up collection, one such extra feature would be the addition of a concept art collection. It's the first, most basic addition that a game developer can add to remasters of their older work. Looking back, I don't remember a single port of Castlevania Symphony of the Night that contained concept art. There are games in the PlayStation Classic that I'm not entirely interested in, such as Battle Arena Toshinden, Cool Borders 2, or Tekken 3, but it still would be interesting to see their concept art. From there, expanded content would include trailers for the games themselves, along with soundtracks. Now, at this point, none of this content would require assets outside of menu, interface, and playback codec creation. Concept art would have to be collected and/or found, depending on how well it's been stored since then. Video trailers would have to be optimized for play as well as music. So I'm not saying new work would not have to be done. Some work would be required, but it would be all to offer a product that would be superior to a straight-up port, which, as I mentioned, likely already exists in one form or another. Past that, if they really wanted to go above and beyond, they could bring along interviews with the developers. Games like Chronicles of Riddick, and I believe Portal 2 did this as well, included in-game audio commentaries. Recently, Nintendo has done something new with their NES collection on the Switch. The Legend of Zelda is available to play as just a full game, alongside a special version of the game that starts the player with the Master Sword, extra items, a full wallet, plus a few extra hearts. The Resident Evil series alone proved how interesting it is to play through a game with different variations of itself, so it would be interesting to see that idea expanded upon other games. One of the biggest problems I have with these classic systems in general is that we're buying into a singular, permanent, without hacking, collection of a few games from the system. Nintendo has already stated that they aren't going to expand on the libraries of the NES or Super NES Classic, and I expect the PlayStation Classic to be the same. What if these systems were meant to be official collector's systems, meant to eventually have the entire catalog, or close enough, available for purchase over time? Like right now there's this first 20 games, then, like Microsoft treating its backwards compatibility, add in a few games every so often, and its library would eventually expand. It would be pretty nifty to, legally, be able to load up any game you'd like at a moment's notice. Alternately, I was thinking about the idea of curated collections. Right now, the collection that's coming out for the PlayStation Classic appears to have been curated by nobody. It's a random assortment of games, consisting of launch titles, a few of the best, and a couple games that aren't really representations of the system, let alone the series they come from. Considering that the PlayStation 1 has a large collection of role-playing games, it would make sense for a collection to focus specifically on those. It had a great collection of platform games, of racing, of sports, so there would be plenty of great opportunities for genre collections. What would my curated collection be? Well, there was an initial set of rules that I was thinking about when choosing my selection, though one of them I'm going to toss out the window, and that is the idea that any game on the Classic should be something that hasn't just been remastered recently. The reasoning that I had for that rule is that, well, if it just came out, it's accessible through other means. Like, why would you play the remastered version or the original version when you have this new remastered title? That would have eliminated the Spyro trilogy, Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, and Crash. And a PlayStation Classic without Crash Bandicoot is a PlayStation 1 without its mascot. The rule that I would be keeping is the idea that all games that are on the PlayStation Classic have to be either PlayStation exclusive titles or they have to be the best version of that title. This would technically keep Crash Bandicoot and Castlevania, because Crash didn't cross over to other systems until much later, and Castlevania's Sega Saturn version was never released in the States. It would, however, mean that Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six wouldn't make the cut, nor would Tomb Raider. Both of those games had PC versions that were released at the same time as their console versions, and in the case of Rainbow Six, the PC version was a lot better. I would still keep the Resident Evil series open, because even though Resident Evil was on both the PS1 and Sega Saturn, it played better on the PS1. Resident Evil 2 and 3 received Dreamcast and GameCube ports, but they came after the PS1 launch. That said, if I was curating a PlayStation Classic library and had to limit it to 20 games, it would consist of these games in no particular order. Number 1. Crash Bandicoot. It's great enough to be remastered, and its character was the representation of the PlayStation for the longest time, despite not even being a first-party game. Resident Evil. Where the horror began, specifically the original version and not the director's cut, as the director's cut messed around with the music in very odd ways. Resident Evil 2. This would be the best of the Resident Evil games on the PlayStation. I'm including both because their tone is different. Part 1 is slower and more of a horror game. Part 2 is faster and more entertaining. Number 4, Metal Gear Solid. The Metal Gear series didn't begin on the PlayStation, but for many people it was their entry into the series. It was one of the earliest titles that blended cinematic storytelling with gameplay, resulting in the nickname of Movie Gear Solid by my own group of friends. Twisted Metal 2. While I still enjoyed the original, its sequel was far improved, and came with a better co-op package to boot. I remember many nights attempting to play through the campaign on co-op, myself driving Outlaw 2, my friend driving the Warthog. I don't think we ever managed to finish it, but we got pretty far. Final Fantasy VII. I think this might actually be the first Final Fantasy game I ever completed, and to this day it's only one of 2 Final Fantasy games I've played through. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. I already mentioned that I'm not into the franchise, but I know a lot of people are. I don't have to be a fan of everything on this thing, so I figure might as well pick a couple titles that have more fan appeal. Number 8, Bushido Blade. There aren't many games like Bushido Blade. It's a fighting game, except it's one that can end in a single cut of the sword. Limbs can be injured to the point that characters begin to have trouble walking, or even standing. This becomes very troublesome in the campaign mode. If you get injured, you still have to fight more guys, even though you can no longer stand on your own 2 feet. Ape Escape. I remember this was a simple fun game. The apes have escaped. Get 'em back. Number 10, Gran Turismo 2. I never got into driving games, really. But what I know of Gran Turismo is that it brought a level of simulation to console racing games that was generally unheard of at the time. Number 11, Suikoden. This was the beginning of another series of RPGs, and is also another title I never got around to playing. I've heard good things, so I'm adding it to the list. Medal of Honor. A long time ago, Steven Spielberg attempted to start up a video game company, the result of which included Medal of Honor, a first-person shooter on the console, back in the day when first-person shooters weren't expected to be any good on a console, and was a great game for its time. Number 13, Tenchu Stealth Assassins. This is another series I missed out on. It was one of the earliest examples of stealth games, and helped innovate for the genre. Number 14, Silent Hill. A long time ago, I remember playing Silent Hill for the first time in a well-lit room. Every so often, the screen would fade to black. It would be a terrible night for a curse, and the world would give way to steel girders and blood, and I no longer tried to fight off my enemies. I ran. Number 15, Xenogears. Another game that I never got around to, but if you're going to add any RPG to the PlayStation Classic catalog, it might as well be the one that's 100 hours long. Number 16, Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey. Yet another game that I never got around to. I figure a tough-as-nails platformer would be an interesting part of the collection. Number 17, Spyro the Dragon. Might as well balance that tough-as-nails with simple and fun. There's a reason why it's being remastered. Number 18, Parappa the Rapper. On one hand, I can never get the timing right on this game. On the other hand, the lyrics from Chop Chop Master Onion, kick, punch, it's all in the mind. If you want to test me, I'm sure you'll find that all the things I teach ya is sure to beat ya, but nevertheless you'll get a lesson from teach ya has become synonymous with the PlayStation 1 era. Number 19, Parasite Eve. Your mitochondria has kidnapped New York. Are you a bad enough police detective to save New York from the birth of the ultimate being? I swear it's good. And number 20, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. There is no game that I've played as many times as I've played this one. For me, it is golden. And you know what? Now that I think about it, it's my own collection. So I'm going to throw in one extra item. A PlayStation 1 accessory even, one that is more important than any game on any list. Without further ado, number 21, a power cord. The power cord, which connected the PlayStation 1 directly to a power outlet. It allowed the PlayStation 1 to actually play its selection of classic games. It didn't need a separate adapter for a player to purchase on their own. The system, regardless of its condition, was a mere paperweight without it. Truly, no gaming session began or was complete without the phenomenal accessory of the power cord. For now, though, thanks for sticking around. Got any PlayStation Classics you wish were on the PlayStation Classic? Let me know right down there in the comments. In the meantime, see you later.